Welcome to Whatcha Readin. I usually do this as a segment on my Ask Chuck Dixon episodes, but I thought, hey, let's try it as a standalone. And the concept here is pretty simple. I'm a working comic book professional, and I'm going to talk about a comic book I read. That seems pretty cut and dried. So this episode is The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers in the 21st Century and Other Follies. It's another very fine hardcover collection from the folks at Fantagraphics, lovingly compiled from Freak Brothers material from the 1980s. Now, if you don't know anything about Gilbert Shelton and the Freak Brothers, I'll give you a little history. You don't just get my opinion, you get a bunch of facts to go along with it. So, my first introduction to Gilbert Shelton was a character called Wonder Warthog, which he did as short stories in a lot of like cartoons and drag-toons magazines in the 1960s. And eventually I found this in a used bookstore, this second issue of a Wonder Warthog's own magazine. And this is really my first intro to the mad world of Gilbert Shelton and his very idiosyncratic cartooning style and sense of humor and sharp commentary on the issues of the day, as we say. Wonder Warthog is very much a superhero parody, but also delved into just about everything going on in the 60s, from the Vietnam War to drugs to crime and all kinds of other controversies. Now, Gilbert Shelton would go on to be one of the pioneers of underground comics. But unlike most of the output of underground comics, which were very much counterculture, very much anti-establishment, Gilbert Shelton's stuff was more like traditional comic books. Obviously very influenced by creators like Carl Barks and Harvey Kurtzman. He created a consistent universe for his characters, unlike the more, absurdist, nonsensical, anti-structure work of many of the other people working in the undergrounds. And, I think I might be mistaken, but of all of the guys that come out of this period, Shelton had the longest, most consistent run of books. Freak Brothers appeared for decades in a number of different titles, in a number of different formats. And Shelton was also the publisher. So that probably had a lot to do with it. He wasn't about to fire himself. But he always found ways, he got himself out of the head shops and into the comic shops. He continues to survive. And these collections are a testament to all of that, to the longevity of the Freak Brothers. Now, who are the Freak Brothers? They're, three possibly brothers. It's never really established whether or not they're related by blood, but they're three guys who live in San Francisco and are very much, they're drug addicts. They're junkies. They're potheads. They're whatever they need to be for the story's contrivance. But they used a lot of controlled substances. And they don't have a lot of control over their controlled substances. And they're very much anti-establishment characters, very much living outside the law. And they're a terrific comedy trio. But rather than just a thumb in the eye to society, like so many underground comics were, some of the underground comics were produced out of, a kind of a sense of meanness, a revolution for the hell of it, kind of destructive, and also produced without a whole lot of attention to craft. Unlike the rest of that, the Freak Brothers are very, there's a sense of humor. There's a gentle sense of humor sometimes a wicked sense of humor, but these comics generally come from a very happy place. They're meant to be funny. They're not meant to be thought-provoking. They're not meant to be any kind of commentary. These comics were not designed to make you feel bad. They were designed to make you feel good. They're silly. I mean, just supremely silly. I don't think any comic artist ever, including Will Elder, Harvey Kurtzman, anybody else you can name, ever delved into the depths of absurdity the way Gilbert Shelton and his collaborators. Like, I have to mention Paul Mavridis and Dave Sheridan as well. And just sort of nutso, gonzo, crazy adventures these characters would go on. And this collection, Freak Brothers in the 21st Century, is no exception. Most of these comics were produced in the 80s, as I said, so of course the Freak Brothers explore the punk scene. There's one kind of eerily prescient story in which Phineas Freak has a uterus containing a fetus transplanted into his body so that he can give birth as a man. And the story is completely nuts, but makes sense within its own reality, as all Shelton stories do. They're always well crafted. They have a beginning, middle, and end. They always have a great resolution, no matter how crazy the setup is. And this story is kind of eerie in the way it saw the future, and a lot of this collection includes satires of other comic genres, mostly imagined by Freddie Freak, who is a comic nut. And then here he sees himself as Conan the Barbarian. He sees himself as a superhero. There's a satire on EC Comics. There's a satire on Howard the Duck, kind of a bitter satire, a disapproving satire of what Marvel did with Howard the Duck, I think, in relation to Steve Gerber being fired off of his own creation, kind of a reaction to that. It's also a very funny story in which the Freak Brothers decide to forego drug use for a day and go sober and see what that's like. And it's funny because as their high leaves them, they depart from their comic book universe into a more real photographic fumetti style to represent the real world. And after several pages of being extraordinarily unhappy, they decide to return to their drug-addled existence. There's also a lot of adventures of Fat Freddy's cat, the peculiarly drawn cat that Gilbert Shelton created as Fat Freddy's pet, who lives in a world of his own. Now, like every Fantagraphics publication, you kind of have to breeze by some introduction or forward or afterword written by an egghead, I'm holding air quotes up here, comic book scholar, who tries to put the work into context. And of course, because these comics were done in the 80s, Ronald Reagan has to be mentioned, right? The Reagan era and Gilbert Shelton reacting to the Reagan era as if the Reagan era somehow was oppressing Gilbert Shelton. When in fact Gilbert Shelton had extraordinary, probably the best success of his career during the 80s, because it was a comic book boom, and particularly a black and white boom for comics. And Shelton enjoyed a level of distribution through the 80s that he never had before when he was selling through head shops and record stores. So I don't think that Gilbert Shelton suffered under the quote-unquote Reagan era, probably benefited from a lot of Reagan's policies. But, and the other thing is Gilbert Shelton's politics are never clear in his story. He's very much populist, very much anti-establishment, but who isn't these days? But that's the fun of it, because characters like the Freak Brothers are very much modeled after, trios like the Marx Brothers and the Three Stooges. And those kind of characters are always anti-establishment. They're always anti-authoritarian, because that's what the humor derives from, these sort of trio of chaos-inducing characters, roaming around the world, leaving havoc in their wake. But it's like you can't mention anything from the 80s without mentioning Reagan. I'm a little tangent here. I watched an excellent documentary on Frank Zappa, and the filmmakers decided they were going to, as a part of Frank Zappa's real-life story, use Ronald Reagan as sort of his bête noire, sort of this figure lurking in the background, oppressing and repressing Frank Zappa as if anything could repress or oppress Frank Zappa. So they create Reagan as sort of this background figure who has this, malevolent effect or dampening effect on Frank Zappa when nothing could be further from the truth. Zappa approved of a lot of Ronald Reagan's policies, especially when it came to business, because he owned his own record label, much like Gilbert Shelton owned his own publishing company. And he approved of a lot of Reagan's policies, and just like Gilbert Shelton, had his biggest commercial success in the 1980s while Reagan was president. And, there was no real sign, no matter how desperately the documentary tried to put this forth, there was no real indication or sign that Reagan's presidency had any negative effect on Zappa's career. He was productive through the 80s, had his most commercial successes during the 80s, and commercial success was never anything that Zappa pursued, obviously. But, he caught on. He was able to up the distribution on his own record label and probably, made more money than he'd ever made in his entire career. So not a lot of repression to be seen. But anyway, I'm it's all of a thing. Zappa, Gilbert Shelton, come from this kind of the same world, the same zeitgeist. So it all fits. And besides, it's my review. I'll talk about what I want to talk about, okay? Speaking of what I want to talk about, hey, if you order my new Conan novel, Siege of the Black Citadel, directly from Arkhaven Comics, I will provide the link. If you order the paperback, you get the ebook free. So and for right now, it's the only way to get the ebook is to buy the paperback direct from Arkhaven Comics. And in case you were asking, yes, the second novel has been completed. It's in the editing stages now, and I'm over a third of the way through the third novel. It was planned as a trilogy, but I'm having too much fun. I think I'm going to keep on going with the Good Cimmerian, and because I just have more Conan stories I want to tell. So if you've read it and enjoyed it, I thank you. And if you haven't read it, give it a whirl. If you're a fan of Robert E. Howard, I'm trying to do him justice here. So anyway, that's it. Tune in next time, and I'll talk about more of what